All right, as you're settling in, I will get my introductory remarks out of the way. So first of all, I am Janet Crum. I am Dean of Library Services here at Fresno State, and I am delighted to welcome you to the 2025 Womack Lecture. The Womack Lecture is sponsored by the J. Prentice Womack Fund, established by the late Rhoda Womack in honor of her husband, who was a librarian here at Fresno State from 1958 to 1970. The annual Womack Lectures focus on bibliographic or social concerns as stipulated in the family's bequests to the library. And fun fact, we alternate years, and this is a social concerns year, which you might have been able to guess from the topic of the lecture. It is my very great pleasure to introduce this year's Womack lecturer, Dr. Kate Manne. Dr. Manne is Associate Professor of the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell University, where she focuses on moral philosophy, feminist philosophy, and social philosophy. She is the author of several books, including Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women, and Unshrinking, How to Face Fatphobia, as well as many opinion pieces, essays, and reviews. Dr. Manne will sign copies of her books after the lecture, and we do have a few copies of Unshrinking that will be available for sale after the lecture as well. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Kate Manne.
Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome and the hospitality from Dean Crum. And I also want to thank Dr. Rosenhagen for organizational labor, along with everyone else who contributed, and for the kind invitation. It's just a huge pleasure and honor to be in this beautiful space with you all. So I wanted to just offer a little content warning. I don't suppose it will be surprising given the title of my lecture, but this lecture will be discussing in some detail misogynistic violence, including sexual assault and rape. So please take care. Okay. So I want to defend in this lecture the view that cruelty is something ordinary. We may not want to believe it, and we may attempt to stave off that realization in any number of ways. But I think it is difficult to deny, especially when one confronts the realities of misogyny and male dominance. Certain men rape, strangle, and beat women, and oftentimes children too, in our own neighborhoods and communities, even our own families, on a disturbingly regular basis. If one wants to examine human cruelty, it is common to begin by examining the periods of historical unrest that make us reach for words like atrocity and genocide. I don't deny, of course, that this is important and illuminating, but beginning closer to home has long been my modus operandi. So in my 2017 book, Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, I begin with an observation. Many of the misogynistic reactions that women face belong to the class that P.F. Strawson dubbed the participant reactive attitudes. These are the non-detached attitudes and reactions of people directly involved in transactions with one another. They are the attitudes and reactions of offended parties and beneficiaries. And in the second person case, involving an I and a you, they include resentment, blame, and hurt feelings, as well as forgiveness, gratitude, and certain kinds of love. They are reactions to the quality of the will that is manifested in the actions, or apparently manifested in the actions, of another agent towards you. Goodwill, ill will, or indifference of the kind that Strawson once called studied. The idea is basically this. If I step on your hand, the pain may be just the same regardless of my attitude or intention in so doing. But if it is a manifestation of meanness, an attempt to deliberately hurt you, or done with a sense that you simply don't matter, I will step on you to get what I want faster, you may intelligibly resent or even blame or hate me in a way that you would not and should not if my misstep was just an accident. The participant reactive attitudes are a reaction to the quality of the will ascribed to recognized human beings who are being held to moral standards during ordinary interpersonal human-to-human interactions. Their will is intelligible, reasonably mature, and morally accessible. So what I'm now going to do is suggest that this kind of resentment and hatred is often what's going on when it comes to misogyny, where someone is perceived as violating a norm, stepping on someone's hand or toes, and she gets hostility, resentment, and blame as a result. Okay. So I want you to imagine a case where you're a woman who's stepping not on a man's hand, but you're committing another kind of trespass. Imagine that you're Virginia Woolf, who opened a room of one's own in this way. You're in Oxbridge, Oxford or Cambridge. It's, a kind of mashup in the book. And you tread on some grass where only men have historically been allowed to walk. Now, that rule has been lifted. Women are actually now allowed to walk on the grass too. But the groundskeeper has internalized that norm so strongly that he bristles when Woolf walks there. He is manifestly, viscerally hostile. She seems like a woman who is treading on men's territory, who doesn't know her place. She has ideas beyond her station, and he yells at her. Okay, second example. Imagine you're a server at a restaurant, and a customer is hungry, waiting for his dinner. He's angry that you're not serving him. Maybe you're not his server, or you're busy with other tables. Or maybe you're moving slowly tonight, tired of your job within the service industry. I think it's easy to imagine this customer growing irritable, even angry. It's easy to imagine him clenching his fist under the table, and it's easy to imagine him exploding in frustration. One more example. You're a woman who is, quote unquote, breaking the heart of a man who has come to feel entitled to your love, your admiration, your sexual attention. You are leaving him, thus hurting him, which in his particular mind is a betrayal. The kind of love that Strawson says two adults may feel reciprocally for each other can then morph into something toxic, a wounded, aggrieved hatred that often inspires, as an empirical matter, deadly forms of violence. The most dangerous time for a woman in a relationship with a man is undoubtedly when she leaves it and him, and he perceives himself as wronged. It's a gendered form of violence that is endemic and moralistic. Or so I argued in Down Girl. In my second book, entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women, I emphasized pieces of the puzzle that I think are important to the explanatory picture as well. The flip side of the sense that women are obligated to please and serve men is the sense that men are entitled to receive certain goods and services from us, including our staying in our lane and out of their territory. Moreover, there is a potent sense of male entitlement to lash out with big feelings when their perceived dues are not forthcoming, both in general and more particularly when women are the supposed debtors. This explains the fact that the resentment, blame, and hatred that often inspire misogyny can sometimes be explosive. It's not just that the beetle bristles, the groundskeeper, he yells in Woolf's direction. It's not just that the customer at that diner explodes in anger. We can imagine him banging his spoon on the table angrily. And it's not just that the aggrieved ex-husband stews. Sadly and tragically, oftentimes he gets out his shotgun. What I hope to have now made plausible with these examples and others is that a lot of misogyny involves the false or at least exaggerated sense that a woman is a wrongdoer. The existence of current or historical patriarchal norms of male entitlement on the one hand and female obligation on the other make conditions ripe for resenting, blaming, and yes, even hating women for our perceived transgressions. From men's perspective, we are often not giving enough. We are insufficiently admiring. We are stepping on their toes or invading their dominion. We do not know our place. We may be perceived as cold, mean, frigid, quote-unquote bitches. And they are entitled, in their minds and by the lights of patriarchy, to protest these offenses and many others. This is part of the logic of misogyny that helps it to make sense from the perspective of many perpetrators. And that logic has no need, at least so far, for the idea that women are sub or non-human. A very common idea about misogyny that I think is just mistaken. Rather, women are human, all too human sinners and malefactors. Of course, there are puzzles. When Elliot Rodger, the patron saint of incels, committed his misogynistic murders in May 2014, he was seeking retribution against women he didn't know except by reputation. How does this even work? I think the answer has to do partly with the way one woman may be treated as representative of a type. Here, the quote-unquote hot blonde sluts that Rodger resented when they didn't turn up on his doorstep ready and willing to date him. Rodger also needed to find women to blame due to the nature of his complaint, it being a perceived sin of omission committed by no particular woman. The women at UCSB's Alpha Phi sorority house, whom he fixated on and stalked from a distance, fit the mold well enough to make them his target. When he knocked on their door, he had loaded weapons in hand and was planning to slaughter all of them for the crime of not wanting him. Okay, another puzzle. Why do the men who seek to harm women sometimes use dehumanizing language? Here, I think there is a fairly ready explanation. Downranking women verbally is one more down girl move among many used to hurt us. We are called dogs, pigs, and bitches, fembots, and so on. But much like the non-dehumanizing term feminazi, these are well understood as insults, together oftentimes with a side of rhetorical justification, because if she is a bitch, then she deserves the harsh treatment. What this suggests is that a lot of misogyny in particular, and I think I want to eventually suggest human cruelty generally, can be explained without recourse to the popular idea of dehumanizing people. So here I'm following the definition of David Livingston Smith, who I think has done more than anyone to illuminate the nature of dehumanization and develop the best theory of how to understand it. And on his definition, dehumanization is a psychological attitude that involves seeing someone as non-human or subhuman, though it's compatible with seeing them as fully human too, and so can make someone appear kind of contradictorily uncanny. I think that David and I are actually in agreement that what is sometimes billed in the literature as dehumanization of women is actually better understood as something else, a form of moral vilification, as I've been arguing. But under the surface, I want to eventually suggest that there are deeper disagreements. Because to put it bluntly, if people can be this awful to women without seeing them as sub or non-human, then it raises the question, when people treat others cruelly in ways that women are treated quite routinely, why would we reach for the idea of dehumanizing people when it isn't necessary in order to treat women in these very brutal ways? Okay. So, misogyny, as I define it, is not constituted by this resentment, blame, hatred, and so on. It should be understood not as a matter of attitude, but rather as the hostility girls and women face when it serves a particular function, that of policing and enforcing patriarchal norms and expectations. It is something that women face, not something men feel in a slogan. And I think it's crucial to recognize that there are misogynistic acts that are not inspired by anything like resentment or a straightforwardly ill will either. Rather, to return to Strawson's picture, they are perpetrated with a sense of cruel indifference and contemptuous entitlement. So what I'm doing here is I'm flipping the picture from women as perceived transgressors to certain particular men as real ones, and emphasizing the fact that their cruelty can be horrifyingly casual as well as routine within a patriarchy. Their actions are nonetheless hostile and hateful from the perspective of the victims, namely girls and women. They thus count as paradigmatically misogynistic despite their thoughtlessness on my picture. Moreover, they stem from and perpetuate a vicious sense of male entitlement to women's sexual services within patriarchal marriage. I'm talking about rape, and I'm going to use as my example a case of mass rape that has been in the news lately. Because I think we need to think about it, hard as it is, awful as it is, and I think it highlights both the ordinariness of misogynistic cruelty and the two kinds of indifference that plausibly feed into it. Okay. So, in 2009, Giselle Pellico, a woman in her late 50s, received a prescription for anti-anxiety medication. Her husband, Dominique Pellico, seized the opportunity. He began crushing it up with sleeping pills and adding it to Giselle's food and drinks. Often ice cream he brought to her in bed, raspberry, her favorite flavor. As a result, she would pass out cold after finishing her dessert and not wake up until the morning. Meanwhile, her husband would rape her and invite strange men into their bedroom in order to rape her too. He drew them maps of the house and surrounds so they could find their way to him in the darkness. Only one man, upon entering Giselle's bedroom, didn't go through with the planned rape and merely sexually assaulted her. The other 71 men did go through with the act, and over 50 of them have now been convicted of rape. Dominique Pellico was sentenced to 20 years in December for his own rapes and orchestration. So I'm not going to speculate on what was going on in Dominique Pellico's mind at any level of detail. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not his psychologist, a fortiori. What matters for my argument is partly what was missing: the guilt and shame, which are the first-person analogues of the second-person reactive attitudes with which I began this lecture, a sign of and form of holding oneself responsible for the quality of will one has manifested to another. Dominique Pellico gave no sign in his testimony that he felt he had done something wrong. Sorry, I think the slide should be... Oh, sorry. Just wanted the illustration of him to hopefully be illustrative of this kind of indifference. So these first-person analogues of the second-person reactive attitudes, guilt and shame, are a sign of holding oneself responsible for the quality of the will one has manifested towards another. And I think Dominique Pellico gave virtually no sign in his testimony that he really felt he had done something wrong. Also important to my argument is the point that he surely did not see his wife of 30-plus years, with whom he had 3 children, as in any way non- or subhuman. Dehumanizing someone is, after all, a deeply othering attitude that holds that the dehumanized party is utterly unlike oneself, somehow a very different sort of creature. The intimacy and social integration that Dominique Pellico long enjoyed with his wife makes this kind of psychological distance unlikely, I think. Moreover, he understood that his wife was suffering from unexplained pains and memory loss. He understood she was someone who felt and experienced horrible pain because he was driving her to the doctor and the gynecologist for what she was suffering. He understood she was feeling ill and exhausted. He was the one making up reasons why that should be so, like saying that that was because she was caring for their 3 grandchildren. So his is a case that I read as not not knowing what, or rather whom, he was dealing with, he simply didn't care, according to my analysis. His is an indifference that is well termed not only cruel, but violent. Dominique Pellico also understood that his wife would not stand for his abuses for a moment, hence his drugging her and rendering her inert and incapable of protest during them. Men like this may fantasize about women as inert, lifeless lumps of flesh and be encouraged in this sick interest by the prevalence of violent and specialized pornography. But this is, if anything, a flight from the knowledge that reality is otherwise. It's a form of escapism. And I think, like David Livingston Smith, we should reserve the term dehumanization for a psychological attitude and not just for a form of treatment that is inhumane. Obviously, this is a form of inhumane treatment, and if you want to call that dehumanizing, you can, but I worry, like David, the, I think, best theorist of dehumanization, that that is leaching the term of much of its intended psychological meaning of actually seeing the other as sub or non-human. So I'm accepting that psychological definition for the sake of my argument here. Okay, so much for Dominique Pellico. I'm in a way more interested in the men who he prevailed upon to rape Giselle. Remember, a full 71 of them, whom he recruited from a website called Without Her Knowledge. These men mostly hailed from the small town in the south of France where the Pellicos lived. They'd moved there in retirement, and they came from many walks of life. They were carpenters and teachers and businessmen and plumbers. They were men who their friends and family members often described as kind, and they were ostensibly very ordinary. I think appearances are not deceiving. These men were very ordinary, and I have a picture from the court again of them here, just waiting for the trial to unfold. Many testified that they raped Giselle out of the sense that they were doing nothing wrong because her husband had given them permission. Others said they thought it was a sex game, a threesome, and didn't rethink this hypothesis when they discovered that she was passed out snoring. This speaks to the prevalent sense that women are the sexual and social properties still of their husbands. There are, again, false moral ideas at the heart of ordinary human cruelty. That Dominique Pellico was entitled to treat his wife in this way, that these men were entitled to take advantage of this setup. I think they acted not necessarily with ill will, but for the most part, that studied indifference or indifferent disregard that is a kind of neglected part of Strawson's picture. And they were indifferent to the obviously human victim of their paradigmatically human violation. The victims of misogyny are, I think, often perceived not as non or subhuman, but as the human subject to norms of sexual ownership within patriarchal marriage. And they are exploited for and by their oppressors, whom they are often married to. Typically, he will be jealously possessive of his property, but sometimes, however, he will be licentious and generous with it in service of his own satisfaction. And nobody said anything. That's the absence of the guilt and shame that I have on the slides there. Not one of these 71 men felt guilty enough afterwards to talk to the police or give them an anonymous tip-off. Not one of them so much as sent Giselle an anonymous letter. Neither did anyone in the small town where they lived, where surely people talk. There was instead, for years, nearly a decade, total and complete silence around these horrors. This, too, is surely violent indifference. The only reason Dominique Pellico was ultimately caught is that he committed a crime in public. He used his phone to take upskirt videos of two women who were strangers to him at a nearby supermarket. The police, upon investigating his computer, they found a related USB drive on it, video footage of the rapes, meticulously labeled with names and dates, in a folder labeled abuses. Dominique Pellico took the videos for insurance purposes in case any of the rapists objected, so that he could blackmail them. None of the rapists objected. The folder was unnecessary and ironically proved pivotal in his eventual prosecution. And its label again suggests he knew exactly what he was doing. He said at the trial that he was still optimistic about reconciling with his wife. It is important to have hope, and that had he not been caught, he would still be happy and she too. Everything would have continued in the same way. He spoke like a man who did not have a guilty conscience. He spoke like a man who was irredeemably entitled. Okay. I want to make one more shift in perspective. I want to think now not just about the two-party interaction between real or supposed wrongdoer and victim. I want to think about the attitudes of third parties which Strawson labeled vicarious. So these are the kinds of things like indignation or disapproval that we may feel when we witness party A's wrongdoing towards party B in a way that would naturally or normally occasion B's resentment towards A. So I have a little corny clip art keyhole picture. So this is the perspective of looking on the wrongdoing or the perceived wrongdoing. It's the third parties, not just party one and party two. So I also want to argue that this attitude encompasses an important form of indifference, that of the spectators, not perpetrators. It is indifference which is equally cruel but more avoidant than studied. Strawson wrote that the personal reactive attitudes rest on and reflect an expectation of and demand for the manifestation of a certain degree of goodwill or regard on the part of human beings towards ourselves, or at least the expectation and demand for a lack of active ill will or disregard. The generalized or vicarious analogues of the personal reactive attitudes rest on and reflect exactly the same expectation or demand in a generalized form. They rest on and reflect, that is, the demand for the manifestation of a reasonable degree of goodwill or regard on the part of others towards others, on the part of those on whose behalf moral indignation may be felt, i.e., as we now think, towards all men. I want to suggest that this last choice of words, written in 1962, is unintentionally telling. Women have often been and continue to be left out of the group of people for whom people at large make demands for and on behalf of. Some privileged men are deemed entitled not just to treat women as well as girls in ways that are, in point of fact, wrongful. They are also allowed to behave in ways that are admitted to be wrongful, but occasion little concern from us, the spectators. The spectators I have in mind particularly turn away avoidantly and refuse to face up to male wrongdoing. They protect and defend the perpetrator. They shrug. They take his perspective. They even shrug about the suffering of the female victims, and in some cases, they blame her. So, sadly, such an indifferent spectator may be a woman herself. She may even be the victim's mother. Okay. When Andrea Skinner was 9, she went to stay with her mother and her stepfather. Her mother was called away for the night, and Andrea asked if she could sleep in her mother's twin bed in the main bedroom. Sorry, I find this case really hard as a mother of a 5-year-old, so forgive me if I get a little broken up. Andrea's stepfather, Jerry Fremlin, agreed, and he then exposed himself and masturbated in front of Andrea from his own bed. The next morning, he climbed into bed with this 9-year-old girl and sexually assaulted her. Andrea told her father and her stepmother with whom she was living. Neither of them acted. The next summer, when Andrea returned to visit her mother, the abuse continued. It continued for many years, with Jerry exposing himself to Andrea and making sexual comments. There is good evidence that Andrea's mother, Alice, knew all along about her husband Jerry's behavior. She later said she'd always wondered if Jerry had raped and murdered Lynn Harper, a 12-year-old girl, who was found dead in Clinton, Jerry's small hometown in Canada, in 1959. This was 7 years prior to Andrea's birth and many years prior to Alice's marriage to Jerry. Alice also admitted that when Andrea was 11, the parents of a 14-year-old girl had informed her that Jerry had been sexually inappropriate with their daughter, to put it mildly. Women's as well as men's complicity in familial abuse and incest is distressingly common. So a classic study of Judith Herman Lewis in the 80s showed that of 40 women whose daughters were sexually molested by their husbands, 37 did nothing, and the 3 of the 40 who initially left the husband all went back to the husband. So not doing anything is historically kind of the norm. So the only reason we know about this case is that when Andrea eventually came forward many decades later, she was exposing someone famous because her mother was Alice Munro, the famous and celebrated Canadian writer. So in 1991, when Munro was tasked with blurbing a collection of short stories, she read the final story about a young girl who was sexually abused and subsequently died by suicide, and was shaken by it and told Andrea about that experience. Andrea felt something shift between them during that conversation, especially when Alice said she couldn't look at her husband, Jerry, during that time. And Andrea said, "I knew that she knew." And Andrea took the opening to finally tell her mother, something which her father had expressly forbidden at the time, saying it would kill her. Andrea sent her mother a letter detailing the abuse, and Munro said that from the first line of the letter, she knew what it would say, that Jerry had abused Andrea. Munro didn't deny it. She didn't deny it, but she reacted like a betrayed wife. She didn't sympathize with Andrea. On the contrary, she initially blamed the 9-year-old girl for seducing her husband and bemoaned the demise of her marriage. She left Jerry that day, but she stayed away only briefly. Soon after, she went back to him and told Andrea that it would be misogynistic of her to blame her for her husband's abuse and not to expect her to sacrifice her own marital happiness because of what had happened long ago. So Andrea eventually broke with her mother and became estranged from her, and she said that there was both anger at her for the affair with her husband, again, 9-year-old girl, and that more than anything, she said, quote, "I really just felt that I wasn't there. I was invisible." She wrote in the Toronto Star movingly about her sickening sense of erasure. She said, "I'd long felt inconsequential to my mother, but now she was erasing me. I felt like my parents might as well have been given a video of me being raped and done nothing." Andrea's case showed that mothers can be not only complicit in abuse, I think they can cease to care about their daughters for the sake of their husbands. They can protect and defend the wrongdoer even while knowing all too well what he did, and even knowing all too well that it was wrong. No one who reads Alice Munro's short stories could doubt her moral sensitivity, if not her moral compass. Many of these stories, by the way, borrow liberally from these events. And more than anything, for my purposes, the idea that a mother could be dehumanizing her daughter in this psychological sense is very difficult to credit. Women like Andrea who speak up to the detriment of beloved and privileged men often become persona non grata, morally speaking. They become people who do not matter or matter little. Perhaps they were always appreciated largely or exclusively for their use value. Or perhaps more subtly, their value was held to be not instrumental so much as conditional on their not costing a beloved man his power and reputation. Whatever the case, when they are hurt, their pain is not protested. They are not protected either. They are among the people who are unhelped or unheld, perhaps better. Like Andrea Skinner, they may even be tasked with holding those who ought to have held them. But I think, again, they are not dehumanized so much as profoundly disvalued. And with this disvaluing comes silencing, disappearance, invisibility, erasure. Many people know all too well that girls are human, and still they let them suffer. It's been proposed to me that much as I define misogyny from the perspective not of perpetrators, but of victims, perhaps we should do the same vis-a-vis dehumanization. Both Quilla Kukla and Vanessa Wills have independently suggested this to me, and I find the suggestion valuable. I think it is here, in a spectator's avoidant indifference, that this sense of dehumanization can most easily be located, where we might feel ourselves dehumanized because we are not looked at as human beings in the full sense who matter in our own right, but rather as impediments to the happiness of others. We are not a person, but a problem. I have no quarrel with anyone who wants to use the term dehumanization in this way, but I'm not sure how often people do use the term in this way, a purely empirical linguistics question, or how often they would do it if offered more precise language, which is a partly conceptual question. And it seems to me somewhat more natural to reach, much as Andrea did, for terms that emphasize the ways such victims are erased and disappeared as moral entities. It is not that she was non or subhuman to her mother in this moment. She was rather a human, all too human nuisance, and to her stepfather a threat. He threatened to kill her if she ever spoke of it. He ended up getting 2 years and a suspended sentence. Okay, bringing it home now. So, I hope to have shown that there are considerable resources within the broadly Strawsonian framework I've used for explaining interpersonal cruelty in quotidian moral terms in conjunction with facts about social hierarchy, especially norms of entitlement and obligation. I've argued that misogynistic cruelty stems from the sense that certain women are wrongdoers. It stems from the sense that certain privileged men are entitled to violate women. And it stems from the sense that at least when they threaten men, certain women simply do not matter. It's thus more a product of moral vilification, entitlement, and devaluation than dehumanization proper. So I've been focused exclusively so far in this lecture on misogyny, but I now want to briefly consider one potentially broader lesson. And I think there are two important reasons to pursue this line of inquiry. One is metaphysical, the other methodological. So I'm really trying to ask the question, if people can be so awful to women without dehumanizing them, do we need to invoke the dehumanization paradigm when it comes to other forms of brutal, inhumane, cruel treatment? And I'm not going to give an answer to that question, but I think that question should be asked a lot more. Okay, so the metaphysical point to be made here is that misogyny, in conjunction with sexism and other patriarchal mechanisms, intersects with every other major form of oppression. Racism, xenophobia, anti-indigeneity, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, fatphobia, and more. So if the notion that perpetrators dehumanize their victims isn't necessary, if it's surplus to explanatory requirements when it comes to misogyny across the board, including trans misogyny and misogynoir, the misogyny extended towards Black women in the US context, to use Moya Bailey's term, then I think this will at least put pressure on the need to invoke the dehumanization paradigm elsewhere. Because, to put it bluntly, every class of oppressed people includes women, pretty much. So this connects with the methodological point that I want to make here. Just as we can ask what happens within history or indeed philosophy when we center women's voices, we can ask what would happen within moral psychology when we center women's predicaments. What would happen, in other words, if we regarded misogyny not as a marginal phenomenon, but placed it firmly at the center of our understanding of how people can and do mistreat one another? What would happen if we approached even the worst historical atrocities with the observation that certain oppressed men may now be facing, at least in part, what women face routinely? I don't pretend to know the answers to these questions, but I think they're at least well worth asking. Okay, so on the view that David Livingstone Smith has developed, people who are dehumanized are seen as both fully human and fully subhuman at the same time. This is meant to explain the fact that, as I've long argued, people who are supposedly subject to paradigmatic forms of supposed dehumanization are often being punished for characteristically human misdeeds and with characteristically human attitudes that we don't tend to show towards, say, non-human animals. Resentment is a very human-to-human thing. So I can't and have not relied on the point in the dialectic that those who supposedly dehumanize others actually presuppose the humanity of their victims. That's true, but someone in the dehumanization paradigm who thinks dehumanized people are seen as both fully human and subhuman can accommodate that point with equanimity. So David Livingstone Smith argues that people who are viewed as both fully human and subhuman, that view comes about because there is ascribed to them a subhuman racial essence. And this results in the dehumanized person appearing monstrous and uncanny. They, as it were, straddle two metaphysically incompatible realms, which inspires a kind of horror. And I think it's a sophisticated view, but it's also kind of Byzantine. It's a pretty puzzling set of contradictory attitudes to ascribe to people. Now, David Livingstone Smith is well aware of this, and in its defense, he mounts two main arguments. First, he adduces impressive historical evidence that people say dehumanizing things. For example, this is true of whites vis-a-vis black people in the United States historically, and it's true of non-Jewish Germans vis-a-vis Jews particularly under Nazism. So, as well as this, David holds that there are strong, if not surmountable, inhibitions against interpersonal violence. So the idea, and this is very common to dehumanization theorists, is that you need dehumanizing psychology to overcome the inhibition against interpersonal violence. I really disagree with that argument. I think that the everyday nature of misogyny shows that the inhibitions against violence are actually rather contingent. They hold when and only when people do not feel threatened, thwarted, and slighted, or entitled. And feeling threatened, thwarted, and slighted by racial minorities is at the heart of white supremacy, and the same goes for anti-Semitism, real anti-Semitism, not anti-Semitism. Okay. I hate that as a Jew I have to say that now in the current climate, but I do. So much for this second argument, but I think the first is more challenging. So one view that I'm open to is that dehumanization, that is literally seeing people as less than human, as well as human in a sense, may have been an important attitude historically, but is much less important currently. I think that's a strong possibility that I'm not a historian enough to comment on. But I also want to suggest a dilemma in closing for the dehumanization theorist like David. So either his paradigmatic forms of dehumanization that include anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism encompass Black and Jewish women, or they don't. If they don't, then I think the idea that dehumanization involves ascribing a subhuman essence to an entire racialized population is difficult to make sense of, because this would need to be possessed by mothers who pass the essence down to their children. Now, if they do, so if, for example, Jewish women were seen as sub or non-human, I think it becomes really difficult to explain the fact that most forms of genocide and enslavement involve the brutal mass rape of women. For example, although it's not necessarily widely discussed, it's now very well established that Jewish women were raped en masse by Nazis during the Holocaust. This fact sits uneasily, I believe, with the depiction of dehumanizers as horrified and repelled by, if fascinated with their targets. And in the case of those who are demonized, which is a characteristic of those who are dehumanized, usually the idea is that these people, the aim is to try to exterminate them without being contaminated by people who are basically seen as monsters. Now, raping someone is, of course, about power rather than sex from the perspective of those who matter most, the victims. But from the perspective of the perpetrators, it is still a sexual act, often a deliberately domineering one, and one which obviously involves intimate contact and entanglement with the victim's body. If Jewish women, say, were held to be these kinds of human monsters whose very bodies are polluted and contaminating in the sense that David Livingston Smith discusses in his work on the subject, then I just don't see how it would make so much sense to tangle with us to rape us, which is, again, a very ubiquitous feature, tragically, of the worst forms of anti-Semitic atrocity and genocide. Okay, so how much more straightforward, if bitter, to hold that human-to-human cruelty is something very ordinary, a matter of resentment, entitlement, and indifference inter alia, including in the case of white supremacists and Nazis. Perhaps no exotic psychological attitudes are needed to explain their abhorrent actions. After all, girls and women typically aren't held to be subhuman, nor is our human status doubted. Despite that, in the end, we are still woefully mistreated. Thank you. Yes, I'd be happy to take questions.
And please step up to the mic here in the aisle so that we can all hear your question clearly.
Someone be brave.
There's so much here, but one of the things that I want to respond to is to look at the word human.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a slippery term.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you could say that there are ways in which women are not treated like, shall I say, regular humans. So, for example, would the men who engaged in raping Madame Pellicot, would they do that to other men?
Mm-hmm.
So, well, if not, well, then we're looking at a different category, right? And I think whether you call somebody human or not, you have to unpack what's included in human. You know, like how much respect is owed to people who have these characteristics or those characteristics. Right?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one of the things I'm kind of pushing back on is the idea that once you recognize someone as human, they're all in the club and they're all just as important as everyone else. Like, the idea in the background here is humans typically, historically, have been ranked according to social hierarchies that deem some of us human, but much less important in terms of our suffering. And so I think in a way there's a supposition that I see as of a piece with kind of Enlightenment ideology, which is, oh, once we recognize you are like us, then all shall be well, and we will open our arms and both embrace you, but also think that you're on a par in terms of how important of a human you are. And I just think that's bunk. Like, all kind of human history points to the way that we are constructing hierarchies not just outside of, but within humanity, such that, to get back to the first part of your question, women are a particular kind of human. We're the human givers. We're the human givers of sex, love, reproductive labor, material, emotional labor, and much else besides which. And so the idea that sex can be extracted via rape in this way with impunity is part of how we're categorized. But I don't think it's a dehumanizing categorization, at least psychologically. It's a way of saying you are positioned as a human giver, not a human being in your own right who gets to live and be autonomous and be respected. You're someone who can be, yeah, if your husband gives permission, then it's fine to violate you sexually. Does that make sense? We are a particular kind of human, and we are a ranked
Not the
human.
best kind, not the one that have to
Not the
that have to
central
get the most
kind.
respect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, too, there's like a part of this picture, which is me pushing back against the idea that, once, or put it this way, there can be a way of leeching the term dehumanization of meaning, which is just to say, if you aren't treated as nicely as the most hyperprivileged white man is, then you're dehumanized. And I think that is rhetorically and semantically a mistake, because it kind of builds in this idea that really any form of treatment or way of viewing someone that isn't exactly what the most central human beings tend to get and are at least perceived as owed is something that is like so radically othering and alien that it's like treating you almost like you're a different species. And again, that seems to me to vastly underestimate how stratified humanity has been conceptually, historically.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks. Great question.
Thank you very much. So I think first I just want to really quickly bear witness to Giselle in one more way. So I think I really appreciate that you brought in the victims, the perpetrators, and the witnesses. And so maybe one active witness is to thank her for insisting on the process going the way it did, and that her name would be shared because she insisted that the assignment of shame needed to land on the perpetrators, and that she knew that she did nothing shameful in her life in that. And what that is made possible for the rest of us, I think is really important. And I just want to add that and thank you. That was great.
So true.
I think the question, though, I want to ask is maybe about the language of dehumanization, because I think I'm almost all the way on board with the argument. I think I might have been more ready than most before I read it and heard it, but I'm almost there. But I also don't know fully what to say or not say when we also know that there is a bunch of dehumanizing treatment that is different than a dehumanizing psychology. And I think that distinction is helpful, but do we just need to understand those as different, and we can keep talking about dehumanizing treatment, the effects of that treatment, instead of the intention? Or do we need to make other linguistic changes?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Carolyn. And I just want to back up and also say, I actually cut this part because in the interest of time, but I just want to say, like, Giselle is a hero. And the fact that she insisted on a public trial and said shame needs to change sides, like, what an incredible service to women, to anyone who has been victimized, regardless of gender, in terms of sexual violence, and to just feminism. Thank you for bringing that up. And she allowed us to bear witness to the wrong that was done to her, and that kind of courage is scarcely to be underestimated. And in terms of your excellent question, so there are definitely folks who argue against David, whose position I've been, accepting for the sake of argument, that look, dehumanization is more about treatment than a psychological view of someone. I actually kind of buy David's argument that tends to make the term unhelpfully undistinctive, and it tends to invoke one of Paul Bloom's ideas, shade into any brutal form of mistreatment, then tends to get termed dehumanizing. And like, what's the point then in calling it dehumanizing as opposed to brutal? So I feel like I do feel sympathetic to my main interlocutors here's argument that dehumanization should be reserved for something in the head influenced by ideology and not a form of treatment that, look, I don't begrudge someone ever in ordinary life who says I was treated in a dehumanizing way, or this is a dehumanizing prison, or, that is fine and I'm not a pedant about it. But I think often it's better termed a specific form of treatment like flattening, cartoonification, reduction to tropes, vilification, infantilization, or just brutal, horrific mistreatment. And the fact that like dehumanizing is to say taking you from this status down means, yeah, that is something that would naturally be read as taking place in the mind rather than a form of treatment that is certainly brutal, but it really begs the question to say that humans aren't treated in this brutal way. I think, unfortunately, gestures to world and history. Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. Very sensitive, very hard, but at the same time, you delivered it very well. And I like hard conversations to have. Now, for me, the question that was raised kind of loud for me is how do we reweave the human dignity? Now that we know that is what dehumanization. Now, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a mental health clinician. I look at the earth and I look at the world. You speak about women are givers.
Yeah.
They bear burden. But also, when I'm looking through the trauma-informed approach, I see that there is something that is coming up within society and embracing that people, it's okay to be treated the way they are treated. And so what is my goal here? Now that this research is going on, your talk reminded me, I lived in Cleveland, and there was a gentleman, not a gentleman, there was a man called Anthony Sowell. He killed 11 women, raped them, and killed them. 5 houses from my house.
Wow. Yeah.
And I had no idea.
Yeah.
And that kind of, your talk evoked that experience.
Yeah.
But the idea, is it the society that is rating this of the harmony?
Yeah.
Women must understand the harmony. Without that,
Yeah.
they have to pay the price. So it is very interesting. How do you expand that in weaving the human dignity aspect for women?
Yeah, thank you for your great question and your work also. I mean, trauma-informed mental health work is so vital, and I see myself as like one tiny piece of like a vast effort that includes work like yours to do justice to victims. Yeah, I think one of the views in the background here is that so much of women's work is really worth doing and is morally vital and has dignity and gives dignity. So when I say women are obligated to give emotional, reproductive, material, and domestic labor, that is both to identify patriarchal oppression, but it's also to point to something which is a genuine virtue and is genuinely important work that will always need doing, and I rush to add, that people of any gender, whether you're man, woman, or non-binary, we should all be doing reciprocally for each other in accordance with our abilities and life stages and so on. So part of what I think goes on in the background is like you find these deep sources of pain that I am very resistant to being empathetic to. It's my term for the disproportionate or undue sympathy, sometimes extended to male perpetrators over female victims. However, it's not to say there isn't like deep social rifts in the wake of feminist social progress, but there's an obvious solution, which is men are not doing the work, and this is not all men. I know it's possible because it's actual to be a man, including a racially privileged man who does this work day in, day out. I know it because I live it. I know it because it's my friends and family and husband and colleagues and so on and so forth. But there isn't the same social expectation, and thus there are a lot of men who get away with not doing this dignified and dignity in supportive work in terms of care for others, including children, elders, community in general, in a way that is giving as well as taking, at appropriate times. And so, of course, like if you're someone who feels no sense of compunction about the moral aspects of this, or just hasn't been educated to see how much you're taking and how little you're giving, if social permissions are extended to certain men, especially hyperprivileged one, to take, and not give, then it's both very painful, it's very empty, and it's very hard when care is withdrawn. But, again, the very easy, simple, and sort of uncontroversial moral solution to this is reciprocal care and mutual aid and collectives, and every human being being raised to think that care work is important, dignified, and not beneath us. And that absolutely includes boys and men. So it's like when people ask me, how would you intervene in order to help with any of this, I'll say, first of all, like I'm more of a diagnostician than anyone who has any solutions. But I do think there is a strong case for early education that combats male entitlement by saying not that entitlement is a dirty word, because we all have entitlements, but rather that we all have reciprocal obligations, and those should be absolutely regardless of gender. So does that make sense, that there's a picture in the background of reciprocity, mutual care, that I just don't see a case against as a moral philosopher. And yet it is so far away from where we are socially. And that gap is where I think a lot of education, therapy, and social programs, policies could be directed towards addressing that gap, which it's not always an everyone wins scenario. There are sometimes real losses when we have greater social justice, but this is an everyone wins scenario. Care work is meaningful, vital, an important part of every human life, always needs doing, is a source of paid as well as unpaid labor, and yet men and boys are not being taught to do it, and that leads to huge social problems, both for women, for men, and also for non-binary folks. So this is my unrealistic, but as I said, uncontroversial vision for what could be done differently, which is we all care for one another. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Sounds good.
All right. Dr. Manne is going to be hanging out on that back table signing books. If you have one of her books with you, please take it back there and get it signed if you'd like. We do have some copies of Unshrinking that will be available for sale. I believe they are $21.75. Now, here's the fun part. These are from the Kennel Bookstore, and they don't have a way for us to take credit card payments for them. So it's cash or check, or you can Venmo me and I'll write a check. So we're going to get through this one way or the other. But we'll be in the back table. Please join us.
Great. Thanks so much, Janet.